If you had been standing on the dusty ramparts of the Castillo Libertador in the harbor of Puerto Cabello on the afternoon of December 13, 1902, you would have witnessed the end of an era and the violent birth of a new world order. The sun was beating down on the tropical coast of Venezuela, turning the Caribbean Sea into a shimmering sheet of turquoise glass. But the horizon was not empty. Cutting through the calm waters were the dark gray silhouettes of iron monsters. They were the warships of the two most powerful empires on Earth, the British Empire and the German Empire. The ships did not come to trade. They did not come to negotiate. They came to collect. At exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the British cruiser HMS Charybdis and the German cruiser SMS Veneta turned their massive turret guns toward the old Spanish fort. There was a moment of silence, a breath held by the entire city, and then the sky ripped open. The sound of the bombardment shook the ground for miles. Clouds of masonry and dust exploded into the air as European shells slammed into Venezuelan soil. This was not a war of conquest. It was something far more cynical. It was a debt collection agency armed with heavy artillery. The Venezuela Crisis of 1902 is one of the most forgotten yet pivotal moments in the history of the Western Hemisphere. It was the moment when the polite mask of diplomacy slipped and the brutal face of imperialism was revealed. It was the moment when the old world of Europe tried to reassert its dominance over the new world of the Americas. And most importantly, it was the moment that terrified the United States into becoming the policeman of the world. To understand how battleships ended up shelling a South American port over unpaid bills, we have to peel back the layers of history and look at the chaos that was Venezuela at the turn of the 20th century. Venezuela in 1900 was a nation on the brink of collapse. Since gaining its independence from Spain in the early 19th century, the country had known almost no peace. It had been torn apart by civil wars, revolutions, and coups. In the 70 years leading up to this crisis, Venezuela had experienced 52 major revolts. It was a land ruled not by laws, but by Cadillo's strongmen who commanded private armies and ruled by the sword. The latest of these strongmen was a man named Cipriano Castro. Castro was a fascinating and volatile character. He was a man of small stature, but immense ambition. He styled himself as the Napoleon of the Andes. He was known for his flamboyant dress, his erratic temper, and his fierce nationalism. He had seized power in 1899, leading a private army of 60 men from the mountains to the capital of Caracas. He called his movement the Liberal Restoration Revolution, but there was very little liberal or restorative about it. It was a dictatorship, pure and simple. When Castro arrived in the presidential palace, he found the treasury empty. The previous dictators had looted the country, the infrastructure was crumbling, and hanging over the nation like a dark cloud was a mountain of debt. For decades, Venezuela had borrowed money from European banks to build railways, ports, and telegraph lines. They had signed contracts with German engineers and British construction firms. But, as the civil wars raged, these projects were often destroyed or abandoned. The loans went unpaid, and the interest piled up. By 1902, the foreign debt of Venezuela was staggering. It owed millions of bolivars to creditors in Britain, Germany, and Italy. But it wasn't just bank loans. During the civil wars, the armies of the various factions had seized property belonging to foreign citizens. German merchants had their warehouses looted. British ranchers had their cattle stolen. Italian shopkeepers had their windows smashed. These foreign citizens complained to their governments back in Berlin, London, and Rome, demanding compensation. Cipriano Castro's response to these demands was simple and provocative. He told them to get lost. He argued that foreigners who chose to live in Venezuela should accept the risks of living in Venezuela. He famously said that the foot of the foreigner would not desecrate the sacred soil of the fatherland. He suspended all debt payments. He established a commission to review the claims, but he stacked the commission with his own cronies and refused to pay a single cent. To the great powers of Europe, this was intolerable. In the 19th century, the bond between a creditor and a debtor was considered sacred. If a nation defaulted on its debts, it was seen as a moral failure and a breach of international law. But there was more at play here than just money. There was national pride. In Berlin, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II was looking for a fight. Germany was a rising power. It had unified late and felt it had missed out on the colonial game. Britain and France had carved up Africa and Asia. Germany wanted its place in the sun. The Kaiser had built a massive new navy, the Kriegsmarine, and he was itching to use it. He wanted to show the world that Germany could project power across the Atlantic. He saw Venezuela not as a country, but as a testing ground for his new fleet. In London, the British government was more reluctant, but they were also under pressure. British investors were furious about their losses. The British Empire was the guarantor of global trade. If they let a small South American dictator stiff them on a bill, what signal would that send to Egypt or India or China? The British felt they had to act to maintain the credibility of the pound sterling. So an unholy alliance was formed. The Iron Alliance. Germany and Britain's historic rivals decided to team up to bully Venezuela. It was a strange partnership. The British press hated it, calling it a partnership with the devil, but the logic of money prevailed. They agreed to a plan. They would send a joint naval task force to the Venezuelan coast. They would seize the Venezuelan navy. They would blockade the ports. They would strangle the Venezuelan economy until Castro paid up. On December 7, 1902, the ultimatum was delivered. The British and German ambassadors in Caracas handed a note to the Venezuelan government demanding immediate payment of all debts and reparations for the damages during the civil war. They gave Castro 24 hours to respond. Castro, being Castro, did not back down. He rejected the ultimatum. He surely believed that the United States would save him. He was relying on the Monroe Doctrine. This was a U.S. foreign policy from 1823 that stated that the Americas were closed to future European colonization. Castro believed that Uncle Sam would never allow European warships to attack a South American republic. He thought he had an invincible shield. He was wrong, at least at first. The President of the United States was Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a man who believed in the strenuous life and the projection of American power, but he also believed in order. He looked at Cipriano Castro and he saw a chaotic, corrupt monkey, as he privately called him. Roosevelt had no love for Venezuela's dictator. When the German ambassador approached Roosevelt months earlier to ask if the U.S. would object to a blockade, Roosevelt had said no. He told the Europeans that if they wanted to spank Venezuela for bad behavior, they could go ahead as long as they didn't take any territory. Roosevelt famously said, "If any South American country misbehaves, let the spanking be administered." So when the deadline expired, the Europeans moved in. The operation began with a humiliation that is still remembered with bitterness in Venezuela today. On December 9, the British and German squadrons sailed into the harbor of La Guerra, the port of Caracas. They didn't just blockade the port. They went after the Venezuelan Navy. The Venezuelan Navy was a collection of antiquated gunboats and converted yachts. They were no match for the modern European cruisers. The British and Germans sent boarding parties onto the Venezuelan ships. They dragged the crews off. And then, in a display of utter contempt, they towed two of the Venezuelan ships, the Totamo and the General Crespo, out to sea and sank them. They didn't keep them as prizes. They destroyed them simply to send a message. When the news of the sinking reached Caracas, the city exploded in rage. Cipriano Castro went to the balcony of the Yellow House, the presidential palace, and delivered one of the most fiery speeches in Latin American history. He shouted, "The insolent foot of the foreigner has profaned the sacred soil of the fatherland." He called on the people to rise up. Mobs attacked the British and German embassies. They dragged the German eagle coat of arms off the consulate wall and smashed it in the street. The police had to rescue the European diplomats from being lynched. Castro ordered the arrest of every British and German citizen in the country. It was a hostage crisis on a national scale. The Europeans responded by escalating the violence. This brings us back to the bombardment of Puerto Cabello. The British merchant ship Topaz had been seized by a mob in the port. The British captain demanded its release. When the Venezuelan garrison refused, the HMS Charybdis and the SMS Veneta opened fire. The shelling of Puerto Cabello was ruthless. The ancient Spanish fort was pulverized. The custom house where the government collected its revenue was destroyed. Civilian homes were hit. The blockade was now total. The British and German ships formed a ring of steel around the country. Nothing could get in. Nothing could get out. Venezuela's economy, which relied entirely on the export of coffee and cocoa, collapsed overnight. Food shortages began to appear in the cities. The customs revenue, which provided 90% of the government's income, dropped to zero. Castro was bankrupt. But the blockade did something else. It woke up the American public. In the United States, the initial indifference to the conflict was shifting to alarm. The newspapers began to run stories about European bullying. They published cartoons of the German Kaiser dressed as a pirate pointing a cannon at a helpless peasant. The American people began to ask why their navy was sitting idle while European monarchies bombed a sister republic. the memory of the American Revolution was still part of the national myth. Americans didn't like kings and kaisers pushing around New World democracies, even if those democracies were led by corrupt dictators. Admiral George Dewey, the hero of the Spanish-American War, was commanding the U.S. fleet in the Caribbean. He was conducting massive naval exercises off the coast of Puerto Rico. His fleet was actually larger and more powerful than the combined British and German squadron. The presence of Dewey's fleet was a silent threat. It was a reminder that the sleeping giant to the north was watching. The situation became even more complicated when Italy decided to join the party. Seeing that Britain and Germany were about to get paid, the Italian government sent its own warship to join the blockade, demanding its share of the debt. It was a feeding frenzy. The sharks were circling a wounded Venezuela. Cipriano Castro, realizing that his military position was hopeless, tried a diplomatic maneuver. He reached out to the United States and asked for arbitration. He said he was willing to pay, but he wanted a neutral third party to decide the amount. He appealed to the principles of justice and international law. This put the ball firmly in Teddy Roosevelt's court. The president was now in a difficult position. He had given the Europeans the green light to punish Castro, but the punishment was getting out of hand. The Europeans weren't just blockading, they were bombing. And there were rumors, dark whispers coming from the intelligence agencies, that Germany had a secret plan. The rumors suggested that the Kaiser wasn't just interested in money. They suggested that Germany wanted to seize a Venezuelan port, specifically the island of Margarita, and turn it into a permanent German naval base in the Caribbean. This was the nightmare scenario for the United States. A German Gibraltar, right on the approach to the Panama Canal, which the US was planning to build. If Germany established a foothold in Venezuela, the Monroe Doctrine would be dead. The Caribbean would become a contested sea. Roosevelt realized that he had made a mistake in giving the Kaiser a free hand. He had unleashed a force that he now had to control. The turning point came in early January 1903. The Germans, feeling confident, decided to push harder. The German gunboat SMS Panther tried to force its way into the shallow lagoon of Maracaibo to shell the city and seize the coal mines. But the Panther ran aground on a sandbar. It was stuck. The Venezuelan gunners at Fort San Carlos saw their chance. They opened fire on the stranded German ship. The Panther was hit several times and had to limp away and retreat. It was a small victory for Venezuela, but it enraged the Kaiser. He ordered a massive retaliation. On January 17, the Panther returned with backup. The heavy cruiser SMS Veneta joined it. They didn't just attack the fort. They obliterated the village of San Carlos. They fired incendiary shells that burned the town to the ground. Dozens of civilians were killed. This was the massacre of San Carlos. When the news reached Washington, the mood shifted from concern to anger. This was no longer debt collection. This was war. The American press called the Germans baby killers. The pressure on Roosevelt to intervene became irresistible. We are now standing at the precipice of a world war. You have the German Navy drunk on its own power shelling villages. You have the Venezuelan army digging in for a suicidal last stand. You have the US Navy spooling up its engines in Puerto Rico, waiting for the order to steam south. And you have the British realizing that they have tied themselves to a lunatic ally in Berlin and desperate to find a way out. As we end the first part of this deep dive, the blockade is tightening. The children of Caracas are hungry. Cipriano Castro is writing letters to the world begging for help. And Teddy Roosevelt is pacing the floor of the White House, realizing that the United States can no longer be a passive observer. He is about to make a decision that will change the history of the Western Hemisphere forever. He is about to pick up the big stick. In the second part, we will see the secret ultimatum that Roosevelt delivered to the Kaiser, a threat so sensitive it was kept out of the history books for decades. We will see the legal battle that followed in The Hague. And we will explore the creation of the Roosevelt Corollary, the doctrine that turned the United States into the self-appointed policeman of Latin America, leading to a century of interventions, coups, and marine landings. The guns of the battleships are cooling down, but the political war is just beginning. The smoke from the burning village of San Carlos drifted over the Caribbean, acting as a signal fire that finally pierced the fog of indifference in Washington, D.C. It was January 1903. The German Navy had just leveled a Venezuelan town, killing civilians in a brutal display of imperial power. In the White House, President Theodore Roosevelt read the naval reports with a grim expression. The game had changed. What had started as a debt collection mission had morphed into a prelude to occupation. Roosevelt knew the German Kaiser well. He knew Wilhelm II was vain, impulsive, and obsessed with expanding German power. If the United States did not draw a line in the sand, now the German flag might soon fly permanently over the Venezuelan coast. This moment marks one of the most controversial and debated episodes in American diplomatic history. For decades, historians believed that the resolution of the crisis was a triumph of polite diplomacy. But later evidence revealed a much sharper edge to the story. According to Roosevelt, in his own later accounts, he engaged in a secret high-stakes poker game with the German Empire. Roosevelt summoned the German ambassador to the United States, a man named Theodor von Holleben, to the White House. The meeting was not recorded in the official logs, but the message was clear. Roosevelt told the ambassador that the United States would not tolerate a permanent German presence in Venezuela. He demanded that Germany agree to arbitration immediately. If the Kaiser did not agree within 10 days, Roosevelt said he would order Admiral Dewey and the entire U.S. Atlantic Fleet to steam south and forcefully end the blockade. It was a threat of war. The ambassador was shocked. He protested that the Kaiser had no intention of taking land. Roosevelt simply looked at him and said that if he didn't have an answer in a week, he would shorten the deadline to 24 hours. He was bluffing with the most powerful cards in the hemisphere. Admiral Dewey's fleet in Puerto Rico was mobilized. The coal bunkers were full. The steam was up. The American Navy was technically superior to the German squadron in the region, and they were fighting in their own backyard. The German ambassador panicked. He sent frantic telegrams to Berlin. The Kaiser, who had been blustering about teaching the monkeys a lesson, suddenly faced the reality of a naval war with the United States. Germany was powerful, but its navy was still growing, and it could not fight a war across the Atlantic without bases. The British, sensing the American anger, also began to back away. The British government made it clear to Berlin that they would not fight the United States over Venezuelan debt. The Iron Alliance cracked. On the eve of the deadline, the German ambassador returned to the White House. He told Roosevelt that the Kaiser accepted arbitration. The crisis was diffused. The battleships would stand down. The lawyers would take over. The blockade was lifted in February 1903. The Washington Protocols were signed. Venezuela agreed to set aside 30% of its customs revenue to pay the debts. But the Real battle moved from the sea to the courtroom. The case went to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in the Netherlands. This legal battle was just as significant as the naval one. The question before the court was simple but explosive. Should the blockading powers Britain, Germany, and Italy be paid first? They argued that because they had spent money and effort to enforce the debt, they deserved preferential treatment. They wanted to be at the front of the line. The other creditors, including the United States, France, and Belgium, who had not bombed anyone, argued that everyone should be paid equally. In a decision that shocked the legal world, the Hague Court ruled in favor of the blockaders. They said that Britain, Germany, and Italy had the right to be paid first. This ruling was a disaster for international relations. It essentially legalized gunboat diplomacy. It told the world that if you want to get your money back faster, you should bomb the debtor. It created a perverse incentive for war. This ruling terrified Latin America. It meant that any European power could justify an invasion simply by claiming unpaid debts. In response to this, a brilliant Argentine diplomat named Luis Drago formulated a new legal theory known as the Drago Doctrine. He argued that public debt should never be a justification for armed intervention or the occupation of territory. He argued that when investors lend money to a sovereign state, they take a risk. And if the state defaults, that is a financial loss, not a cause for war. The Drago Doctrine became a rallying cry for Latin American sovereignty. But in Washington, Teddy Roosevelt drew a different conclusion. He looked at the Hague ruling and he saw a trap. If Europe was legally allowed to invade countries to collect debts, and if Latin American countries continued to be chaotic and broke, then the United States would face constant European interventions in its sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine, which said Europe couldn't colonize, didn't say anything about debt collection. Roosevelt decided that the Monroe Doctrine needed an upgrade. He needed to close the loophole. In December 1904, in his annual message to Congress, Roosevelt unveiled his new policy. It became known as the Roosevelt Corollary. The language was polite, but the meaning was imperial. He said that chronic wrongdoing, or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, may, in America as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And then came the kicker. He said that in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Translation: the United States was now the policeman of the Caribbean. The logic was simple. To prevent Europe from intervening, the United States would intervene first. If a Latin American country couldn't pay its debts, the U.S. Marines would land, seize the customs houses, collect the money, and pay the Europeans on their behalf. We would become the repo men so that the Kaiser didn't have to. This was a massive expansion of American power. The Monroe Doctrine was defensive, telling Europe to stay out. The Roosevelt corollary was offensive, telling Latin America to behave or else. The consequences of this doctrine were immediate and long-lasting. In the next 2 decades, the United States invaded the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Cuba. In each case, the pattern was similar. The country was unstable or bankrupt. The U.S. Marines landed. They took control of the national bank and the customs revenue. They established a protectorate. They balanced the books. And they ensured that American strategic interests were safe. The Venezuela crisis of 1902 was the catalyst for all of this. It was the big bang of American imperialism in Latin America. But what happened to Venezuela and Cipriano Castro? Castro had survived the blockade, but his victory was hollow. He had been forced to sign humiliating agreements. His economy was ruined, and he had made powerful enemies. The United States, which had saved him from the Germans, now viewed him as a liability. They saw him as a chaotic element that invited trouble. Castro's health began to fail. He suffered from a kidney ailment. In 1908, he made a fatal mistake. He traveled to Germany, of all places, to undergo surgery. He left his vice president, Juan Vicente Gómez, in charge. Gómez was a different kind of animal. He was quiet, cunning, and ruthless. While Castro was on the operating table in Berlin, Gómez made a deal with the United States. With the support of the U.S. Navy, which stationed warships off the coast to prevent Castro's return, Gómez seized power in a coup. Cipriano Castro, the man who had defied empires, was left stranded in exile. He spent the rest of his life wandering from port to port, banned from returning to his homeland, dying in Puerto Rico in 1924. Juan Vicente Gómez would rule Venezuela with an iron fist for the next 27 years. He was a brutal tyrant, but he was the kind of tyrant the U.S. liked. He paid his debts. He kept order. He opened the country to foreign investment. And then, in 1914, something happened that changed everything. On the shores of Lake Maracaibo, geologists struck oil. The Zumaque No. 1 well blew. Venezuela wasn't just a land of coffee and debt anymore. It was sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world. Under games, American oil companies flooded into the country. Standard Oil, Gulf Oil, Texaco. They built the rigs, the pipelines, and the refineries. Venezuela became the fuel tank of the Allied forces in World War II. The debt that had caused the battleships to attack became irrelevant. Venezuela was suddenly awash in petrodollars. But the legacy of 1902 remained. The fear of foreign intervention became a permanent part of the Venezuelan political DNA. The rhetoric of Cipriano Castro about the insolent foot of the foreigner was resurrected decades later by leaders like Hugo Chavez, who used the memory of the gunboats to rally nationalist sentiment against the West. The crisis also changed the architecture of international law. The Drago Doctrine eventually gained acceptance, influencing the creation of the League of Nations and the United Nations charters, which outlaw the use of force for debt collection. The bombardment of Puerto Cabello proved to be the high watermark of gunboat diplomacy. The world realized that allowing bankers to command battleships was a recipe for global chaos. As we look back at the Venezuela crisis today, we see a mirror of our own times. We see the tension between sovereign debt and national sovereignty. We see the danger of failing states in a connected world. And we see how the decisions of powerful nations, to intervene or not intervene, can shape the destiny of a region for a century. Teddy Roosevelt's big stick kept the Europeans out, but it brought the Americans in. It replaced the chaotic imperialism of the Old World with the hegemonic order of the New World. For Venezuela, it meant that the gunboats disappeared, but the shadow of the giant to the north grew longer. The ironclads that shelled the tropical forts in 1902 have long since rusted away. The Kaiser is gone. The British Empire is gone. But the Roosevelt corollary lives on in the unspoken assumption that the Caribbean is America's backyard. And the debt that started it all serves as a grim reminder. In the game of geopolitics, if you owe the bank a little money, you have a problem. But if you owe the bank a lot of money and you refuse to pay, you might wake up to find a battleship in your harbor. The lesson of 1902 is that finance and firepower are two sides of the same coin. And when the ledger is unbalanced, blood is often the currency used to settle the account. This is John, and this is the Untold History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve. Because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. Thank you.